If you were a woman in history, being a woman wasn't just about wearing crowns or being burned at stakes. It was about surviving in a world that was never made for you, and yet still leaving scorch marks on the pages of history, from queens who commanded empires to women who managed something as extraordinary as a miracle, from the happy witch who hushed her hounds to the donkey lady of Los Angeles with hooves and a tail. Women have always made the world, even when we're making it alone. History tries to tell us we're not enough, but Anne Keel wonders what that hat ever did to it. That's the deeper story this video is exploring. More than just names and dates, it's rage, fire, and power, long extinct. 2 things before we go in, and first of all, let's stick with me until the end of this video, because the ending will blow your mind. Second, once it's all over, leave a comment and let me know just one thing. How are you feeling? Inspired? Angry? Powerful? I want to know. Now let's begin. Like all great legends, she was born in silence, not an explosion of thunder, but a whisper of resistance. Her mother taught her that being a woman was having a war on the inside of your ribs that you must never illustrate, never show, but always fight in a mapless village of forgotten things, remembered by only its curses. She knew from the beginning that the world feared women who knew too much, spoke too loud, bled without apology. Centuries passed. In every corner of the world, a girl like her was rising. In Egypt, a young girl named Hatshepsut despised everyone from the shadows and dreamt of turning invisible so she could rule better than any man who came before her. When the moment came, she didn't seek permission. She donned the false beard of a pharaoh and led armies like a god. They wanted to strike her name from monuments, but stone has memory, and her story found a way to break through. In Europe, queens reigned on precarious thrones, plotting chess games in blood and silk. Elizabeth Mine never married, not for want of suitors, but because she knew the crown is heavier when divided. Her enemies conveniently labeled her a virgin. Her people referred to her as a mother. But truly, she was a woman who made her vulnerability armor and her solitude strategy. She had no need of a king. She was the storm they feared, the storm they thought would surge if she dared to love too loudly. But not all women had a throne. Some had firewood. And the witches, oh, the witches, weren't the wicked ones of fairy tales. They were midwives who knew too much from anatomy, and herb women who had been too independent, widows who didn't quite wait long enough. And then she shook her head and folded her arms across her chest and took a step closer to him. They were women who lived beyond control, so they were all hunted, labeled, burnt. Towns had gathered to savor their deaths, not because they were dangerous, but because they were a reminder to everyone that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it reeks of rosemary and walks about barefoot. And what of the warriors? The ones who did not wrap themselves in silk or exude a scent of herbs. In China, Hua Mulan went off to fight in her father's stead, disguised as a man. But it wasn't strictly filial duty. It was rebellion of a sort, the kind that seeped into her bones and would not sit. She did not demand to be recognized by the emperor. She just survived, went home and melted into myth, as many women do unseen but not unforgotten. And in Africa, Queen Nzinga straightened her back and trembled her enemies. The Portuguese governor denied her a chair during talks, so she commanded one of her soldiers to crouch down, and she perched on his back, facing down the man who thought himself above her. That was not only politics, it was performance. She didn't need his respect. She took it. The joke is that every time a woman has ascended to power, historians retroactively deemed her either hysterical or divine, never human, for to be a woman in power was to be a symbol, either to be worshipped or to be destroyed. Cleopatra, too seductive. Joan of Arc, too righteous. Mary Wollstonecraft, too loud. Harriet Tubman, too brave. But they all, each among them, cracked the surface of a world that believed it was unshakable. Yet still, the other of them battled their quiet wars in kitchens, brothels, and on battlefields. Women who never appeared in textbooks. Mothers hiding runaway slaves in basements. Lovers forging passports by candlelight. Scientists whose work was stolen. Poets who published under men's names. Revolutionaries carrying grenades in their dresses. They may have become footnotes in history, but they were the ones to light the fuse. And each time the world tried to shove women toward silence, they found ways to shout anyway, not necessarily with sound, but with action. A stitched flag, a coded letter, a glance that meant defiance. They learned to turn the lacy, the deceits, lullabies, anything they had, into a weapon against the status quo. This is only the beginning. They say history is written by the victors, but really, it's just written by the loudest men in the room. Women, after all, had been too busy with the business of staying alive to write their own headlines, but their fingerprints are all over the world's inflection points. You just have to look at them sideways to see them. A few did battle with sharp pens and wit greater than any sword. In 18th century France, Olympe de Gouges roared out her Declaration of the Israel Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. While revolution seethed around her, men talked about liberty, equality, fraternity, and she included one word the men left off: sorority. They chopped her head off, of course, not because she was mistaken, but because she had the audacity to say that women deserved the same freedom they were bleeding for in the streets. Her death wasn't a silencing. It was a scream you can still hear if you lean in closely enough. Farther east, in Japan, the samurai class had another code, Bushido. But that didn't matter to Tomo Gozen, who went roaring into battle like thunder personified. He didn't just follow the code, she rewrote it. Her being on the battlefield was no exception. It was a reminder. Discipline, fidelity, and ferocity knew no gender. They inhabited a world of belief, and hers was impenetrable. And then there were those who learned to wield power, not with steel, but with whispers. In Mughal India, it was Nur Jahan who ruled from behind the veil, her husband more a puppet than a partner. She signed imperial orders. She led troops. Coins were struck bearing her name, not his. In a world that kept women in shadows, she became the source of their light, a subtle, strategic, unstoppable one. It wasn't always crowns or cloaks. At times, resistance concealed power on the cotton fields of America. The enslaved women who, like Sojourner Truth, picked more than cotton. They picked apart the lies of the society that told them they were property. She declared in front of white men, "Ain't I a woman?" Not a claim to insolvency, but a dare. She wasn't asking for permission to be seen. She was demanding recognition for a truth that had always been perfectly obvious, that women were not fragile creatures to be protected, but formidable ones to reckon with. On the other sides of the ocean, in Haiti, a woman, Sanité Belair, fought in the revolution against French colonialism. They gave her a blindfold before executing her. She refused. If she was to be killed, she wanted to look her killers in the eyes, because that stare, defiant even in death, wasn't only hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever dared to be herself fully in a world engineered to make her small. In the salons of Europe, meanwhile, women like Mary Shelley and Ada Lovelace were writing futures in ink and algorithms. Shelley and her monster, pieced together from dead bodies, gave life to science fiction, a man's world, but one that is the brainchild of a woman. Lovelace looked inside a machine of gears and cogs and saw a soul, not a real one, but a computational one. She was the author of the first computer algorithm, at a time when computer was still a job title for an individual using a pencil. Women have been making up what did not exist ever since, because what did exist seldom served them. Even in the 20th century, when the world was riven with wars and ideologies, women were in the thick of both, not just waving goodbye to soldiers, but writing codes, jumping into enemy territory, leading spy rings. Nancy Wake, the White Mouse of the French Resistance, was worth more when captured than most generals. Once she killed a man with her hands, the kind of necessity that women have always known. When nobody's coming to save you, you have to be your own cavalry. And yet, despite the blood and the fighting, they also found a way to make things. Frida Kahlo painted pain and passion in a way that was hard to ignore. The story is about more than just broken bodies, but broken systems, broken dreams, broken expectations. And she transmuted her own suffering into a gallery of truth that forced the world to see beauty in defiance, color in scars, and strength in femininity. Each generation has endeavored to tame women with corsets, laws, cages, myths. But women are not made to be tamed. They are oceanic. They flood when pushed, rise when resisted, undercut the foundations of all that thinks itself eternal. Not just with fury, but with standing power, the kind of resilience that persists over the centuries of being told to sit still, look pretty, and wait to be saved. But they didn't wait. They constructed underground railroads. They muttered secrets into radios. They exchanged messages in laundry lines. They came together in sewing circles and created revolutions in teacups. Their strategies were frequently invisible, yet so is gravity, and look what it holds up. Women weren't just queens or witches or rulers. They were architects of possibility, and when power wasn't handed to them, they fashioned it out of shreds and darkness. Holler when you're ready for part 3, and I will keep the story going. There have been times in history when being a woman was to become a ghost while still alive. Your name murmured beyond closed doors. Your ideas co-opted by others. Your tales sliced up into the final cut. But there were ghosts that would not disappear, some power of haunting history such that they have burned themselves back into existence. Moscow, early on in the Cold War, when Soviet ideology and individual identity conflicted in countless ways, a woman there named Lyudmila Pavlichenko fought her way to become one of the deadliest snipers in the history of World War II. They named her Lady Death themselves, not because she wanted it, but because she had delivered it with a cold precision. Over 300 confirmed kills. She hardly ever smiled in photographs. She didn't flinch in battle. When asked by a group of American journalists about her makeup, she declared, "I wear my uniform with honor. I don't kill for producer fees. I kill fascists. Not with lipstick, with bullets." That shut them up. And then there were the silent armies, the women who built nations while being told to stay in the shadows. In India, ladies took to the streets with Gandhi, spun cotton as an act of principled protest, and then courted arrest without batting an eyelid. But not all did so peacefully. Some, like Rani Lakshmibai, picked up the sword. When the British tried to seize her kingdom, she dressed as a soldier, strapped her infant son to her back, and led her warriors into battle. They called her a rebel. Her people referred to her as a goddess. She did not fight for glory, but for dignity, and she did not die in defeat, but in battle. Women like her didn't seek thrones. They took them, not because they deserve it, but because they have the nerve. In other places, the fight played out in more peculiar ways. In America, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, loud, self-righteous, necessary, and most often fronted by men. Yet behind each podium was a woman, working, plotting, persevering. Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten and sterilized without her consent, and still went before Congress to say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Her voice filled the room, not with sound, but with truth. In war-torn Korea's shadow, a girl named Kim Hak-sun joined the scores of thousands of women who survived Japanese military brothels known innocuously as comfort stations. Years later, she was the first to publicly talk about it. Her voice, cracking open history's silence. She didn't want pity. She wanted accountability. And she got it. In some cases, resistance meant just staying alive. In Nazi-occupied Europe, women like Irina Sendler slipped Jewish children out of ghettos in toolboxes and coffins. She recorded their names on scraps of paper, stuffed the notes in jars, and put herself at risk of death for every breath she helped them take. Such bravery can never be captured in a statute, and she never asked for one. And yet, the myth endures. The women of history were silent, passive, supportive. But this is a fiction honed for centuries and presented as reality. Real women were strategists, commanders, rule breakers, rule makers. And when there was no chair for them at the table, they turned it upside down. Even in myth, women wielded power the world had no frame of reference to comprehend. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, was never a mere sidekick. She was the brains of the operation. In Norse mythology, the Valkyries didn't greet new souls at the gates. They decided who lived and who died. In the cosmology of the Yoruba, Oshun used sweetness like a weapon. Her love could drown empires. Her wrath could starve gods. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. Dismiss women at your own risk. In time, the stage changed, but not the script. When Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, she didn't round her edges, she sharpened them. Love her or hate her. She walked into rooms of men who wanted her out, and she made them sit down. Same with Angela Merkel, who didn't govern Germany with fire, but with steel-cold logic. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. Her silence was strategy. But even in an era when women are making their way into newsrooms, boardrooms, and parliaments, the old battles have not disappeared. They've simply exchanged costumes, hashtags instead of swords. Rather than trials, there is trial by online. The modern witch hunt does not carry torches, and it does not need to. And still, women rise. They are the ones who rear children and nations. They organize protests and peace talks. They write code and poetry. They outlive systems intended to wear them down. They are told to be soft, but to carry steel in their spines. How small they are supposed to be, you ask. But how many galaxies they occupy. For every woman, queen, or their as yet unnamed rebel, bears the burden of all who preceded her. The dead, the disappeared, the banished. And whatever step forward she takes, she's dragging history out of the fire and saying, "Turn it down, this is mine now." She wasn't born brave. No one is. Bravery is a muscle, and hers was developed through pressure and repetition and pain. In every time, in every culture, someone taught a girl to make herself smaller, to speak softly, to have no desire, and in each age, something else, a sister, a stranger, a storm in the shape of a woman, revealed how to open up again. Power has never had just one look. In Mexico, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz covered her mind in religious clothing. In order to learn undisturbed, she leveraged the convent like a loophole, a fortress of solitude, the isolation of which she filled with the reading of a philosophy and the writing of poetry that desperately combs through the gender expectations as if picking fruit. They attempted to muzzle her with scripture. She responded in fire, masked as verse. She went to war with the British, using guerrilla tactics so effective they study her in military academies. 7 months pregnant for much of her time on the battlefield, she wasn't a gold medalist, and she didn't issue press releases. She had lived in the woods, led warriors, and disappeared like wind after battle. No one could catch her. You don't capture hurricanes. You survive them. So it wasn't, always, that leadership had been picked. It was forced. In Vietnam, the Trungs rode elephants to battle the invading Chinese. Not elephants as in a metaphor. Real elephants. They didn't inherit armies. They constructed them in rage and in loyalty. And when at last they did fall, according to legend, they drowned themselves rather than be captured. History has attempted to cast them off as mere lore, but statues still stand. People still kneel. That's not some myth. That's your memory. Women's resistance has always been encoded. When they were unable to write manifestos, they quilted them. When they couldn't get elected, they kept communities together. When they couldn't march, they whispered through lullabies the instruction. Their revolutions arrived disguised as recipes, prayers, braids, and bedtime stories, even in science, where cool reason was supposed to reign. Women were ignored. Rosalind Franklin deciphered the structure of DNA even as the men were taking credit in their shiny shoes. It wasn't just overlooked, it was repackaged. They would call it Watson and Crick's model, while her data lay mutely, but being the truth. It was like seeds. It always finds light. Her name in some classrooms echoes louder than theirs. History eventually pukes out the lies it has been fed. In politics, they were ridiculed for being overly emotional until they made empathy a form of leadership. Golda Meir led a war-torn Israel with grit scorched as dry as her wit, and that carved through diplomacy. Benazir Bhutto came out of exile with death threats stamped on her passport. They both knew the risks. They took the seat anyway, and behind each protest was feminist backbone. They made the posters, organized the food, got the permits, got the bruises, got the jail time. And when the camera came, the men took the mic. It didn't matter. Real leadership isn't steered by spotlight. It's back-end by stamina. Women, however, have that in spades. There is a violence in being forever questioned. Are you sure? Can you handle it? Do you even belong here? These aren't doubts. They're arrows through the heart. And women have learned to catch each one in the air and stitch them into suits of armor. Not the shiny kind. The kind that's grown under the skin. Even so, the world conflates softness and weakness. They view tears and don't realize that crying is not giving up. It's letting go. It is pressure escaping a steel body. Women have wept in childbirth, on the battlefield, in interrogation rooms, and carried on. That isn't fragility. That's inhuman strength wrapped around its humanity. And yet still today, in skyscrapers and slums, in labs and lecture halls, women are rewriting what power looks like. Not all of them are volume leaders. Some lead with presence, with the gift of entering a room and commanding it to listen. No, not shout, because there is no need to. They have centuries within them, bloodlines of burned witches, diaries of hidden queens, the coded footfalls of women who ran before sunrise and tiptoed back before breakfast as if nothing had happened. They are miracles, drained of magic, from repetition, and yet, even as they soar, it still feels like resistance. We live in a world that even now calls a man assertive and a woman difficult. That's what makes a man strategic and a woman calculating. That rewards male ambition and punishes female drive. But here's the catch. Women already know this, and they keep going anyway. They persist through pay gaps, glass ceilings, stolen credit, unwanted opinions. They persist across centuries of being interrupted mid-sentence, through workplace harassment masquerading as compliments, through laws that govern their bodies like traffic signals, in the condescension of, you should smile more. And still, they lead, they love, they build, they burn and rebuild. Their stories were always mandatory. They were essential. They are the neglected half of every history book, the dissipated name behind every achievement, the fingerprints on every revolution. She was taught to speak through her eyes, for it was to mouths that danger was attached. A woman who opens her mouth will lose everything, but a woman who opens it, that's rebellion under the guise of subtlety. And sometimes that is the only way to survive when history has a muzzle ready for your mouth, but not your stare. From the Andes to the Arctic, women have always found ways to lead, even when there was no possibility of doing so. Matriarchs were the true power in native communities. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, it is the clan mothers who selected chiefs and had the power to depose them. This centuries before any European dreamed of a democracy. These weren't exceptions. They were blueprints, but colonialism bulldozed those truths and laid down pavement over them in the form of polite lies about progress. But the truth will crack pavement eventually. In South America, Michaela Bastidas was at the side of her husband in the Peruvian rebellion against the Spanish. Not behind, beside. In reality, many said she was the strategist, the engine, the mind. She was captured. They held her back and made her watch while they killed her son, and then they killed her. But her silence was not submission. It was the sound of history tightening its chokehold around a neck that would never be severed from its people. Centuries later, her name lingers in chants, murals, whispers. Women in history have a way of doing that, haunting, not with malice, but with reminders of what was stolen, of what they built anyway. In the middle of Afghanistan, girls were going at great risk of death to attendance secret schools under Taliban rule. In basements and behind curtains, information exchanged silently, hand to hand like contraband. Teachers taught lessons in hushes that were like prayers. Young students learned the letters of the alphabet by candlelight. These were more than classrooms. They were the front lines. Books became weapons. Verbal affirmations turned into deeds of resistance. Seed is always sown from where the future will grow. And then there are the women who didn't make it into the stories. Not that they were at all lacking in courage, just in audience. The laundresses who carried missives between resistance cells. The nannies who listened into embassy conversations. The janitors who installed bugs under desks and disappeared into mop closets. No statues, no headlines, just impact. A power that's not always loud. Sometimes it's patient. They had an expression. Behind every great man is a great woman. But that's flattery hiding a lie. Women weren't behind. They were beside. They were ahead. They were dragged back, shut up, sidelined, but never, ever stopped moving. You don't have to sit in a front row to affect the course of history. You just need momentum. And women have mastered that. They've danced in protest, sung in revolution, bled in silence. They've etched their names in stone and, sometimes, into nothing, betting that someone, someday, will recall. And now we do, because memory is a rebellion as well. Every little girl told to be small is shouting the rebellion of every woman who ever said no. Every girl who doubts her value is a spark from a flame that blazed centuries ago. Not every woman with her keys between her fingers is a loon. She is preloaded with survival algorithms body-coded like bone memory. Sirens, seductresses, she-devils they were called. We code all that as they frightened someone who thought he was going to elicit submission and instead encountered resistance. Women who took power for themselves were always considered dangerous because power in a woman's hands shatters the mold. The design suggests be modest, be agreeable, be grateful. But queens don't ask for permission, witches don't follow rules, and leaders don't bend to fit anyone's comfort zone. Look at Malala Yousafzai, a girl who was shot for wanting to go to school and turned that bullet to a Nobel Peace Prize. If only when we thought of Lema Gbowie, who called women together with nothing more than prayer, white t-shirts, and silence to stop a war, we considered it one and the same as the lofty rung of the presidential ladder we hoist a man to after being entertained by the rage of a black woman. Consider every woman who has ever said no, when silence would have been safer. They aren't just role models, they are cautionary tales for systems that might have thought they could hold back the tide. And for each name recognized, there are thousands of others, anonymous, uncredited, incomplete. The girls were married away before they could dream. The women who birthed empires in disguise as families, the caretakers, the code breakers, the peacekeepers, the unsung architects of small resilience. They not only survived history, they helped make it, and they're not done. She entered a room, and the room got the chills. Not because she asked it to, because it had no choice. That's the silent gravitational pull of a woman who knows what she has to offer, even in a world that tells her it doesn't see her. Especially then, in Iran, when the revolution looped back around on itself and theocratic law came bearing down on women's bodies. They didn't all vanish, they transformed. They turned into whispering networks of resistance, underground bookstores, underground parties with hair and music and fire in their blood. And then, when the death of Mahsa Amini sparked outrage, the women came again, not only with signs, but with scissors. They shear off their hair, as one might sculpt away centuries of oppression, one strand at a time, public, raw, unafraid. The world watched, stunned. But this wasn't new. It was history repeating itself, just in 21st century attire. The oppression is always upgrading, so women evolve faster. In Saudi Arabia, where women weren't allowed to drive, they filmed themselves doing so. Not for the thrill, but for the evidence. I can. 2 words that reverberate louder than engines. Jailed, mocked, erased. The message registered even then. It's not like change was a gift from above. It was hauled in, wheel by wheel, by women fed up with asking nicely. You can feel it all over. The change. The old stories are cracking. Now, the heroines are kicking aside the margins and standing squarely at center stage, with dirt under, their nails and centuries in their gaze. Dandara didn't wait for freedom in Brazil. She stole it, fought for it. She broke her chains, ran away from slavery to join the Quilombo dos Palmares, and learned capoeira in raiding Portuguese colonists. She wasn't a symbol. She was a strategist. She didn't simply desire liberation. She wanted a country where no woman, no man, no child would ever have to bow again. She was killed before she could witness any of it, but her name echoes like thunder through the bones of every woman who will not kneel. That is because these stories are like that. They are timeless. They just reload. Even in societies where women were supposedly worshipped, the line between pedestal and prison was wafer thin. It sounds like a dream to be a goddess, until you remember that to be a goddess is often to be objectified into silence, seen, not heard, admired, not followed. But real goddesses screamed in knives and lightning. Not only were they revered, they were feared, and there's not enough sculptures, let alone ones that tell that part of it. Fear has always been part of the mix. The world isn't scared of women being weak. What it fears is women discovering that we're not. And strength comes in a lot of different forms. Some led armies, some managed households with the precision of generals, others led by example in the silence, raising children to be better than the world, teaching daughters to challenge everything, and sons to unlearn the poison they were fed. Under apartheid South Africa, women like Winnie Mandela were not flinching. They were met with rubber bullets and tear gas and betrayal, and they kept walking. She was dismissed as too radical, too dangerous, too bold. By the way, that tends to be effective. In Harlem, Audre Lorde didn't merely write poetry, she detonated it. Your silence will not protect you, she said. And generations of women have either tattooed that truth on their hearts or lived it. Meanwhile, women were setting up parallel systems in kitchens and corners, mutual aid networks, protest logistics, emergency plans. They knew the formal systems would let them down. They always had. So, they made their own. Queens are fun to celebrate from a ironical distance. Yet then as now, they were nearly always made fun of, targeted, or assassinated. Because when women are in that position of power, they change the axis of what's possible. And power hates possibility. It prefers predictability, obedience, legacy that is a mirror. But women aren't mirrors. They're lenses. They focus everything. They cut through distortion. They don't reflect. They disclose. And in every generation, in the dark at times, in the dark, women kept moving. They communicated knowledge through recipes and rituals, lullabies and side eyes. They used a code language when language was dangerous. They were in the know about which herbs to employ and which doors to rap on, what secrets to keep. Their invisible empires were founded on survival and solidarity. Even today, when progress struts around like it has done something noteworthy, women know better. They know that a female in a CEO seat can still be harassed in a parking lot, that a woman president can still be talked over by a man with nothing on his mind. But that access isn't always safe, and yet they persist. They push. They are fighting battles their grandmothers never could have fathomed. Even as they clean up messes their grandmothers were not allowed to discuss. They are buildings and custodians of justice, architects and janitors of it. In every cause that counted, women's blood was mixed. Civil rights, labor rights, climate action, indigenous sovereignty, LGBTQ+ liberation. And every time they were asked to move over, they said, "We're already here." She didn't want a crown. She wanted space. Space to breathe, talk, occupy without always being tracked, named, contained. But denied that. She claimed the crown anyway. Not as a prize, of course, but as a protest. Because if they won't let you in the room, Unless you have rule it, then rule it. In feudal Japan, despite the Onabu geisha being seldom recorded, they were here. Militant female fighters, they defended homes while their husbands went off to war, and sometimes when their husbands didn't return. Nakano Takeko was killed in action, leading a troop of women. She asked no one to remember. She simply refused to be erased. There's a difference. History often gets lazy. It blunts the counter-narratives. It reduces revolutions to parables. But the truth is jagged. It doesn't always wear uniforms or wave flags. It wears a nursing apron, at times, or a headset or high heels on a body that aches everywhere, but stands and cycles because it's still standing and cycling. Consider the women of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They didn't have power. They had purpose. They even smuggled weapons in loaves of bread. They memorized escape routes. They had guns that were shaking in their hands, and they were still shooting them. There are no towering monuments high enough to calculate that kind of resistance. And consider the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. The state disappeared their children, kidnapped, tortured, erased, so they marched. Every week, same spot, headscarves on, images of their missing children, gripped in trembling hands. The regime described them as hysterical. The world called them brave. But they weren't in search of applause. They were demanding answers. And Treasure said that decades later, they're still marching, where grief can become activism by not going numb, in tech, in labs, in startups. Meanwhile, women have had to battle for credit for work that changed the world. Katherine Johnson did the math for Apollo 11, and she still had to ask if she was allowed in the room. Not yet, was the answer, until it was clear the answer no longer mattered. The math was just too perfect to ignore. Here's the paradox. Women typically have had to be twice as good just to be seen in the room. The witches, they've never gone away. They simply ceased to call themselves witches. Now they are doctors, doulas, herbalists, sex educators, counselors, still the healer, still the guide, still the terror for those who would rather buy pain than have it soothed. Witches were never wicked. They were merely inconvenient to authority, and power can't stand anything it can't control. The queens, they still wear crowns, but now they're metaphorical. A CEO building a company from a couch, a single mother working double shifts and raising revolutionaries, a teacher who could teach you how to rewrite futures. If only she had a whiteboard and not a budget. They rule kingdoms of chaos and then turn up the next day to rule them all over again. And the legendary leaders? They appear in every protest photo, each courtroom in which someone finally says, I object. Every hospital where a woman of color must fight for her own life because the system will not. Every refugee camp where someone gathers scraps and dignity to organize food for hundreds. Every woman who shouts no is saying so louder than the rules dictate. And not everything's about big moments. It's also about the silent grind, the translator for her parents, who continues to get straight A's, the woman who escapes an abusive home with nothing but a backpack and a steel rod down her back, the woman who finally decides to choose herself after being told for so long that she's nothing without another person. Every one of them is history, not a footnote, a force. And that's what makes the story bigger than crowns and flames. It's about choice, about survival that turns into strategy, on trauma that can be transformed into tools, of women who didn't wait around for permission to become legendary. They simply began behaving like it, because women are not given power in the world. It gives them rules. Meanwhile, women are going to burn those rules for kindling. So, here we are, standing on the shoulders of about 8 million who were told to sit down. We talk because they whispered when it wasn't safe. We stand because they trudged through the flames. And here we are, florid and loud and out of control, precisely because what they did led, again and again, to what they never could have done. She was not the first. She simply did not want to be the last. That's what legacy, as a woman, looks like. Less being celebrated than leaving the door cracked open behind you, so the next one doesn't have to break it down with her bare hands. In the American South, Fannie Lou Hamer stood in the beating sun to tell the Democratic Party the truth. Black women were the spine of the movement, not the curtain behind which it took place. She had been beaten, sterilized, degraded, and yet here she was, standing before microphones and saying, "I didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." That sentence is not politics. It's about space. It's about how women are no longer asking. They are taking back what is their due. In Rwanda, tens of thousands of women entered government after genocide shattered the country. Today, Rwanda has one of the largest proportions of female members of parliament in the world. Not because it was fashionable, but because it was needed. When the country needed rebuilding, women weren't asked to join. They went there anyway, rolled up their sleeves and said, "Let's fix what you broke." Necessity has always been an opening. When the world shatters, women sweep up the pieces, rewire the entire system, and most of the time receive no credit for the reconstruction. But that's the rhythm, written out after the fact, vital in the recovery. The history books might have jumped over her, but the truth did not. In Korea, Yu Gwansun, protesting cloaked in courage, shielding her eyes from the zenith May sun, Yu Gwansun led demonstrations against Japanese colonization when she was just 17 years old, imprisoned, tortured, killed. They had sought to grind her youth out of her, as they would some weakness, but she's remembered now, not as a martyr, but as a catalyst. And sparks spread. They proliferated along the factory lines of early industrial England, where women and girls toiled long hours and mutilated hands and had no voice. But one day they walked out. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 was not only a wage issue, it was about dignity. On not Fleming blood for a boss who never learned your name, they didn't just halt production. They ignited labor rights. And still, today, women are still rising in places no one thought they could. In the Maasai villages of Kenya, where patriarchy is the norm, women created Umoja Village, a place where men are forbidden. Survivors of abuse, forced marriage, and violence joined forces and built a refuge from scratch. No outside funding, no blueprint, nothing but collective rage, intelligence, and a refusal to be governed by fear. Here's what people forget. Leadership doesn't always look like a podium or a sword. Other times, it's a sewing needle. It may be a nurse's hand, slick with someone else's blood. Sometimes, it's simply one woman saying enough, and another woman hearing her and saying, me too. And pooh, presto, a movement is born. It's not always noisy, but it is always present. Women have learned to lead in whispers, in winks, in gestures so faint they become invisible until they change everything. A secret radio station in a regime, an embroidery with a secret code gifted to a prisoner, a song only the oppressed can hear, sung in words. That's the kind of intelligence you acquire when being seen is a danger. And in any war, women have been both the soldiers and the survivors. In Ukraine, Syria, Palestine, Congo, pick a crisis, and you'll find women not just enduring it, but managing logistics, doling out food, protecting children, documenting crimes, and piecing entire towns and communities back together, out of ruin and memory. They don't do it because it's the easier path. They do it because it won't happen unless they do it. That dictators fear an educated woman more than a battalion. A woman with a book can unweave the propaganda of a lifetime in a single conversation. A lady with a camera can tell the truth in 30 seconds flat. A woman with a question can bring down a corrupt empire. And when the women lead, things don't just change, they transform. They become more human, more nuanced, more whole. And why shouldn't we? Women know what it's like to be left out, to be left behind, to be underestimated. And so, when they do lead, oftentimes whatever manner they lead in, some style, it's often through a level of empathy, which cuts much more deeply than ego. Still, they hear them, too angry, too emotional, too much. But this is what the world seems to keep missing. Anger is not weakness. It's data. It's an alarm. It's the sign that injustice has become too obscene, and somebody's finally got the courage to call it. And too much? That's just fancy talk for more than we really had any reason to hope for you to survive. So they keep coming back. Too loud, too brash, too brilliant, too kind, too strategic, too powerful. And history always catches up, no matter how long it might be. On Sunday, she said she did not rise because someone had cleared the way. She rose because there was no road, and she grew tired of waiting. So she chiseled it with calloused hands and stolen time and invisible effort that nobody clapped for. But she walked it anyway, and now others run on it. Some revolutions are loud. Others look like paperwork. Like Shirley Chisholm tossing her name onto a row of presidential ballots in 1972. Not as a publicity stunt, but because she understood to the bones that if nobody runs, nobody can ever win. They called it impossible. She called it necessary. She added, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. That wasn't just a quote. That was a battle plan. And in other parts of the world, women were not just bringing chairs. They were flipping the entire table. In Liberia, when war devastated the country and no one paid attention, Lema Gabowi assembled Christian and Muslim women side by side. They wore white. They locked arms. They prayed publicly, blocked doors, withheld sex from their husbands, and wouldn't leave until peace was signed. Not a shot was fired, but a war was averted. History doesn't often know what to do with women who create change without creating chaos. Women for whom undoing violence is about their presence, who led not by domination, but by not going away. But sometimes they do both. In the Philippines, Gabriela Silang led a rebellion after her husband was killed. They wanted her to mourn in silence. She howled with swords, strategies, and uprisings. They caught her. They killed her. They tried to make an example of her. They did. Simply not the one they had in mind. These women rise not because it is easy, rather, because you can't help but. For silence is heavier than risk, because fear loses its power when the price of staying small becomes too high. And what of the women whose names we will never know? The enslaved women who risked being whipped in teaching their daughters to read by candlelight. The immigrant mothers who scrubbed floors, whispering ambition into their children's ears. The women in arranged marriages who saved up paltry sums in secret mason jars, dollar by dollar, until freedom fit in their pocketbooks. They led too. They led hunched over, with quiet voices and dreams buried beneath their sense of duty. But they led. They didn't get statues. They got lineage, bloodlines of fortitude inherited like family treasures. That's legacy with teeth. And even now, there are girls with torchlights under the blankets, reading banned books, women coding after midnight because the tech industry still believes innovation has a gender. Parenting, standing in courtrooms, turned war zones in an effort to keep their children alive. Grandmothers, writing trauma into lullabies. Because therapy is not always there, and love is. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about responsibility. And women have borne the weight of change uncelebrated for centuries. They lead when they listen, when they protect, when they put everything on the line and tell the truth, when, in a one-on-one capacity, they say, "You're not crazy," to someone for the first time. That is power, and power, once seized, does not go quietly into the night. It gets passed from hand to hand like a torch, a flame that will not go out. It multiplies. It is why systems work so hard to keep women divided, to turn them against one another, to prove to them that there's only one top dog, because unity is a terrifying prospect when it comes from those of us who have historically been denied a voice. But women keep coming together, nonetheless, across cultures and religions and languages and generations. They link arms. They forge connections through looks, alliances through empathy, because they understand it is not enough just to survive. To thrive is the true revolution, and so they keep pushing. They push against beauty standards that would have them shrink, against laws that do not take their autonomy into account, against industries that profit from their labor, but not from their leadership. They even push when they're tired, especially then, because women don't just suffer history, they remake it. She didn't seem dangerous. That was her advantage. That's how women have survived for thousands and thousands of years. By being underestimated, unassuming, misread. "We'll let them believe you're fragile," they said. "Smile. Wait." In the meantime, she was learning the cracks in the system, charting escape routes, discussing the plan. History mistook her silence for absence. That's why it lost control. In colonial India, as the British clamped down, women did not stand around and wait for the menfolk to rise in revolt. They operated underground schools, wrote dissident poetry, and concealed fugitives in the folds of their saris. During Gandhi's march, they sneaked salt across borders, not as followers, but as logisticians. Left out, the revolution would have collapsed beneath its own romance. The world watched a quiet rebellion. Behind it, tough women glided like ghosts past checkpoints. That's the actual enchantment. Not vanishing, but changing positions in ways power cannot follow. There were, in the American Civil Rights era, not only Martin or Malcolm, it was Ella Baker, the behind-the-scenes organizer who built networks that lasted longer than slogans. She thought that strong people don't require strong leaders. They just need space to lead themselves. She wasn't spotlight seeking. She wanted structure. She gave the movement bones. And in South America, in the dirty wars, women would become the chroniclers of the disappeared. Each name, each date, each face. The memories held by mothers and grandmothers who walked around with grief like chainmail, determined not to allow memory to die. Those are the troublemakers I'm talking about. But trouble in the fledgling system is nothing if not justice. You see it in every tribal tradition. The women who carry more than they are able to carry: water, children, grief, knowledge, and still walk on, and we're still being told to smile while we do it. But smiling isn't submission. It's code, it's disguise, it's control. A smile on a woman's face has made it through police interrogation rooms, courtrooms, funeral homes, and modern open-plan offices where every emotion is subject to judgment, like a kind of performance art. And to an extent, the pressure has been unending even now. Be fierce, but not too loud. Be beautiful, but effortless. Be supportive, yet self-sufficient. Be everything, but not too much of anything. But women do it anyway, and still get back up, because they remember. They remembered the mothers who had been denied the right to vote, the grandmothers who needed permission to have credit cards, the ancestors who were bartered, sold, draped, silenced, stoned, erased, and still managed to leave clues. Every woman who has ever lived, and every woman alive today, walk with a library inside themselves, a line of warnings and wisdom. Some of it was written in blood, in lullabies, in the intervals between one sentence and the next. Listen carefully and hear centuries murmuring, "You are not alone." And then there are the women who burn up tradition just enough to see the road ahead. The rappers that spit truth over beats louder than sermons. The comics who dismantle sexism with punchlines so sharp you bleed laughing. The tattoo artists, the sex workers, the shamans, the outlaws, those who dwell outside the strictures, not because they are damned, but because they already plotted an alternative course. And the quiet radicals too, the caretakers, the lunch packers, the women who show up every day to keep someone else's world spinning, even as they press pause on their own dreams. It's not nothing, that kind of sacrifice. It's non-existent heroism. It fads, but it lasts. It is easy to love a woman who leads a revolution. It is harder to sing the praises of the ones who keep catastrophe at bay every goddamned day, because keeping things together is not a passive activity. It's tactical. Women are the firewall between chaos and continuity, between breakdown and build-out. They are not the background. They are the undergirding, and they know what's on the line. They understand that history will repeat itself unless someone stops the cycle. And women have been interrupters all along, of violence, of silence, of injustice, long seen as normal, sometimes through law, sometimes through art, at times with an unblinking stare that says, "Ah, see you, and I won't let this stand." So they keep rising, not just one by one, but in waves. A girl in Tehran, a lawyer in Lagos, a DJ in Detroit, a healer in New Zealand, a coder in Jakarta, a grandmother in Istanbul, all living separate lives, yet all sharing the fierce urgency of pulling the thread of history in one direction, forward. She was spent, but not done. That's another myth. That exhaustion translates into surrender. No, women have been running on empty for millennia and still propelling the whole world uphill. Tired isn't the same as finished. Tired simply means she's been lugging more than her load. Yet again, in Haiti, Catherine Flon fought not with a rifle, but with a needle of the ruined sections of a colonial flag cloth from which she sewed the first Haitian flag. That's not tailoring. That's nation building. Yet no classroom fills with her song, but needles can be keener than swords when they stitch a people. And while the war across the two countries may be fought in the shadows, women do more than survive in those shadows. They organize, they ration, they document. In Sudan, when war broke out again, women made WhatsApp groups to evacuate neighbors, handed supplies across barriers, mapped safe zones within their heads, the way GPS is powered by instinct. No medals, no headlines, nothing but quiet, relentless logistics. While the world argued on Twitter, women don't need glory. They need each other, and they do find each other in the smallest ways. A hand on a shoulder, a nod in a meeting, a message of "I believe you" when no one else will. That's the revolution under the revolution. The invisible bond of mutual recognition, solidarity in the dark, a code older than empire. In the meantime, institutions still act as if equality is the pilot program, as if women haven't already paid their dues and done their part in any role imaginable: astronaut, assassin, activist, analyst, architect, artist, you name it, and then some, and still they're asked to prove it, and again, and again. But proof is not the issue. Permission is, and women stopped asking. Consider the courtroom where Ruth Bader Ginsburg sliced away injustice with a scalpel-like precision. Just gaze at Greta Thunberg giving the glare of truth to global leaders, louder than their sound bites, and listen to Beyoncé turning stages into sermons. These aren't just icons, they're instruments, tuning forks for what the next generation imagines is possible, because girls today have grown up seeing women lead, not in theory, in real time, and they don't want to be princesses. They want to solve problems, makers, movers. They're not interested in glass slippers. They have been waiting for combat boots, keyboards, passports, and toolkits, because they know what happens when women are permitted to lead without being interrupted. Things work, people are seen, systems change. It's not magic, it's long overdue. In every metropolis, you will encounter women trying to rebuild trust in institutions that have betrayed them, where culture didn't, teaching consent and demanding justice in a place where tradition had told them to remain silent, running community kitchens, running for office, running campaigns that save lives, while still supposed to know when your friends' birthdays are and when you need to put more milk in the refrigerator. Multitasking is not a skill. It's a survival instinct in response to being everyone's safety net. And still they show up. Braids tight, schedules tighter, smiling not because they're okay, but because they are not about to allow the world to define them by their wounds. Pain has even been weaponized. Women are instructed to cover that up, deny that, act graceful about it. But pain is a signal, and they've learned to listen, learned how to turn it into language, into fuel, into a call to action. Because being a woman in history isn't only about what you do, it's also about what you carry, the dreams, the danger, the doubt, and continuing to walk forward with all that, carried in one hand, as we build something else with the other. Its authors have always had to build with one hand tied behind their back, the other one's usually keeping the storm at bay. She knew they were watching, measuring, judging, waiting for her to slip, to break, to snap, just enough to be able to say, "See, she couldn't handle it." But that is the oldest bait and switch in the world. Give a woman half the tools, twice the pressure, and then call her weak when she bleeds. But she didn't break. She adjusted her stance. It's the twist they never saw coming. Women recalibrate faster than anyone. Millennia of adaptation baked into their DNA. And when they were forbidden to write, they memorized. When they could not speak, they sang. Once they were burned, they became legend. Pain wasn't the end. This was the start of pattern, recognition. You can see it in the gait of each migrant woman who traversed a border, not in the spirit of adventure and novelty, but out of sheer necessity for life. One child on her back, another clutched in her hand, language she didn't speak, currency she didn't own, and still, she built a life, constructed it out of whatever lay around. Prayers, plastic bags, recipes, muscle memory, and in the dim corridors of science, where textbooks had relegated women to the footnotes, they continued to turn up. Lisa Meitner co-discovers nuclear fission and is coincidentally not invited to the Nobel Party. Chien-Shiung Wu revolutionized physics and was never given her due. The equation remains the same. Contribution minus credit equals woman in science. But names are not the legacy. Impact is. In the streets of Myanmar, women took to the streets with flowers in their hair and bullhorns in their hands, attending protests at which bullets are shot to show disapproval of the military junta. In Chile, grandmothers danced in a square in anger, still seeking justice against crimes that had transcended the headlines. Young women in Poland painted thunderbolts on their cheeks and stared down riot cops for reproductive rights, not for any vanity, but for volcanic determination. This is not fragility. This is pressure converted into precision. Women don't just resist, they reimagine. They reimagine everything: love, leadership, strength, faith. They take the hard edges from hard systems when they must show compassion, or sharpen them when they must show consequence. They understand that kindness without limits is exploitation in a dress, and they have learned not to mistake silence for peace. Now, they are not asking anymore whether they can change the world. They're choosing how. Some opt for politics, knowing they'll be dragged for every outfit, every wrinkle, every second of emotion. Others decide upon art, painting their pain in colors too bright to look away. Some go tech, making the tools to ensure the future is less rigged than the past. Some go for the street, the clinic, the school, the stage, all valid, all revolutionary, because being a woman is not a monolith. It is a multitude, and every version should have a seat at the table. The mother, the fighter, the CEO, the monk, the mechanic, the one who is fluent in 12 languages, the one who is just beginning to learn how to say no, the one who's been shouting her whole life, the one who's finally done with whispering. They're all history. They're all vital, and they're no longer alone. Now, the era of isolation is coming to an end. The age of networks is here. Women lifting women, sharing knowledge, sharing protection, sharing platforms. One goes up, and she reaches back. That's the real revolution. Not so much breaking ceilings as taking off the whole damn roof. They have learned that survival is the baseline. Joy is the rebellion. So now they not only survive, they dance, they rest, they create, and they need space not just to work, but to breathe, to be full, contradictory, imperfect, powerful in spite of, because of, without, no business, not on your terms, no business but yours. To be women on their own terms. She was no longer needing space. She was taking it, not viciously, definitely, with the quiet assurance of someone done with being questioned, done with being tolerated, done with being reduced to a symbol. She didn't need approval. She needed volume, range, space to exist outside of the roles they had created for her. Because at every point when history said woman, it meant something constricted, something passive, palatable, patient. But that one, that suit, was a costume stitched from fear and sewn to bones that were grown to carry so much more. The actual women were hardly ever just waiting in castles or crying in towers. They were mapping plots in the margins of holy books. They were burying blueprints in lullabies. They were weaving resistance into their daughters' hair. See the women of the Zapatista movement, masked, marching, mothering the revolution in southern Mexico. And they did not stand behind the men, but among them, peeling off these power relations and replacing them with dignity, autonomy, land, and freedom. Not as theoretical notions, but as strategy. Their battle wasn't abstract. For them, it was food, water, identity, the right to live without the fear of being erased. That's what it comes down to. Not always glory, only there that is continued existence without erasure. And look at what much of the world's indigenous women are doing. The water protectors, language keepers, cultural anchor women. Colonialism aimed to scrub the earth of them, but they refused to budge. Sowing the seeds, telling the story, refusing assimilation, not with fists, but with memory. They weren't just preserving traditions, they were saving times to come that the world beyond didn't realize were at stake. It is a different kind of warfare, one that goes by wisdom, not weapons. And for that matter, in corporate towers, where one of those glass ceilings still gleams smugly, women show up with fire in their eyes and resumes twice as thick. They decode boardroom doublespeak, out-negotiate entire departments, negotiate sexism disguised as banter. They keep receipts. They are building empires between meetings. And as they leave, they don't walk out. They start consulting firms, write the book, mentor the next generation, and cast everything they have done as a cautionary tale. The next time, you had better value us while we are still here. Even in prisons, women lead. They form alliances, organize education programs, create support groups, turn punishment into community. The system tries to reduce them to numbers, to shame, but they regenerate. Even in captivity, they find subterfuged ways to reclaim agency. Even when they are locked out, they manage to worm their way back in. It's because leadership isn't about being seen. It's about velocity, direction, energy that can't be denied. And women carry that as if it were part of their bloodstream. At all times and on all fronts, they've been given the impossible to do, and do so without making a fuss, keeping families whole as they break cycles across generations, trying to heal others, but also handling their own trauma, smiling while in pain so as not to make others uncomfortable. But now, the silence is breaking. Now women are naming things out loud. Shame, molestation, power's dynamics, burnout, generational wounds, all yanked into the light. No more whispers. No more choking back rage to support someone's ego. They are done disappearing themselves to be eaten because they're learned. You can't be both powerful and palatable at once, and you shouldn't have to be. There's something threatening, too, about a generation of women who know their worth, that have stopped waiting to be rescued, to be acknowledged, to be repackaged, who are now building their own platforms, telling their own stories, piling up their own dollars, and redefining what success even looks like, because success was surviving the system. Now, it's about rewriting it. She didn't soften in order to be liked. She sharpened to be heard, because at some point along the line, women gave up waiting for the world to change, and figured it never would, unless they kicked it awake. Not with permission, with precision. And that's what this era feels like. The awakening, not the beginning, the middle of something huge. An unspoken tipping point, borrowing from centuries of the quiet swells of the past, the clandestine truths, secret gatherings, and stories handed from one pair of hands to another, under regimes and religions and rules, hoping to steal them. It was never just about breaking one rule. It was a matter of breaking the cycle. And that's exactly what women have been doing almost surgically, across continents, across classes, across belief systems, sometimes aligned, sometimes chaotic, always necessary. In Uganda, women took to the streets, marching naked to protest colonial taxes because they knew the power of their bodies was sacred and terrifying. In Pakistan, the Aurat March turns streets into waves of poetry and protest, the women demanding rights 100 years overdue, and so basic it's an insult to still have to demand them. In Hong Kong also, women were at the front wearing goggles and holding umbrellas, not because they wanted war, but because they didn't want to be trampled. And even in the smallest villages, where there are no cameras, no internet, no hashtags, women still come forward, nevertheless, secretly educate their daughters. Still they demand land. Still they demand safety. Still they refuse to be reduced to labor with a womb. The revolution is not always viral, but it's happening everywhere. And still, resistance isn't their only language. Joy is too. Creation is too. Laughter in the ruins. Lipstick in the rubble. Dance in the wake. Because if they've learned anything, it's this. If you don't claim joy, they'll take that as well. So women take it loudly, unapologetically. They form collectives, throw festivals, create art spaces and online platforms, and underground bookstores and healing retreats. They do not just protest, they propose. They're not just asking, what's wrong? They're building what's next. Yet still, for step forward, there's the waiting backlash. Always. Misogyny with a new logo, oppression with better PR, a dress code here, a law change there, a smear job laced with respectability politics. But women are good at reading the fine print. They've always worked by unwritten rules anyway. And what's different now is they're calling it out, naming it, laughing at it, burning it down when needed. There's no freedom without friction, after all. And they're not afraid of the fire now. They've been burned before. Now they carry the match. And when women begin to live fearlessly, when they understand they do not owe anyone an explanation for their bodies, their choices, their ambition, their anger, their softness, their growth, here's what happens. Systems get the sweats. Because there is no way women leading without fear are going to move around like pawns. They move like storms. They disrupt with a whisper and a shout, professionally and chaotically, traditionally and not at all. They write plays and poems. They take down empires and table talk myths. They raise their sons differently, and they don't dull their own light to make others less uncomfortable. And yes, they are still interrupted, still talked over, still doubted. But now, they try to scuttle mid-sentence, reclaim the mic, redirect the gaze. They're not just speaking for themselves, after all. They're speaking for every woman who bit her tongue so hard I'd bled. This is generational justice, a recalibration of power, of language, of what we can even fathom for hundreds of years. After all, the question has been, what can a woman do? Now the answer is, anything. Just watch. She was poised at edge of everything, not alone, but with 1,000 voices running through her spine. The voices that had been silenced, buried, rewritten, discredited, and now nothing came, for all of them spoke at once through her, not as ghosts, as legacy, like lightning that had at last located somewhere to strike, because it was never only her story. It was a constellation. Joan, Harriet, Artemisia, Simone, Noor, Valentina, Rigoberta, Lily Wokalani, Nanny, Boudica, Marcia, Tarana, Kalpana, each of them a flare shot into the night sky of history. Brief, perhaps, but never forgotten. And now, the sky was a raging inferno, and the darkness running out of room. For every queen who ruled contrary to expectation, there was a girl who learned to walk a little straighter. For every witch who burned, there was a healer who elected to remain hidden until now. For every leader who ever stood on a podium, there were thousands who led behind closed doors, behind enemy lines, behind expectation. All of them mattered. Every single one of them mattered, even if no one ever chiseled their names into marble or struck their faces on coins. Because real power doesn't require a statue. It just needs memory, and women are through allowing memory to be stolen. They are remembering themselves, vociferously, fully, brazenly, and today, as the world attempts to tame them, they laugh. It tries to silence them, they publish. When it seeks to erase them, they make art, make law, make noise, make space. And yet, they're not asking to be made into saints. They're not demanding that you call them perfect. They are messy and angry and nuance-riddled and brilliant, exactly as they are. That's the point. To be human and to take up space. They know now that there is such a thing as sacred rage, that softness can be a sword, that borders are by birth, that rest is resistance. It's a beginning, not a terminus of survival, and they've ceased defending themselves. No longer must they translate their ambition into politeness. No more dimming their brilliance so someone else can feel big. No more demundification for people who weren't really listening to begin with. Now, they tell their own stories, and they do it in ink that never fades. Can you feel it? On walls and pages, on stages, and in courtrooms, in the streets and across screens. The tale of women, silenced in the past or spun by other people, is no longer being edited, at least not in the same old way, by fear. It's being authored by fire, with every refusal, every confrontation, every breakthrough, every damn breath. Because being a woman in history was never just about surviving. It was about ignition,